There are 5 workshops in the Writing at the Graduate Levels series. Each of these workshops includes a Blackboard component. If you decide to complete the Blackboard component, you will be eligible after all 5 for a Writing at the Graduate Level certificate. As you go along in this workshop, we have several moments in which we have reflections and questions for you to work on. It may be useful to keep out a pad of paper or an open Word document, as some of these reflections are actually part of the Blackboard activities. One of the most common forms of writing that basically it continues whether you're an engineer in science or you're in nursing or even the fine arts is the literature review. The literature review becomes kind of a stalwart of all graduate writing. And it can often be one of the more challenging pieces, but I find it one of the most creative. The way I can express myself in a literature review I find really exciting. So what does a literature review do? Well, the goal of a literature review is basically twofold. One, to say that we understand the field, that we understand what other scholars have been doing, we recognize it, we can analyze it, and also to say, hey, this is where I come in. If I'm doing my own work, this is where I fit. This is who I'd be talking to. So it both says I understand the work around what I'm doing, but also I understand how that work can aid my own project. So whether you're working on a comprehensive literature review, a critical one, a historical one, all of these involve filtering and organizing information. And this is the really key to your contribution to a literature review. This is why literature reviews can be published, because of this organization of information. Now, the challenge with this is we still have to go back to that notion of a reader. And that though we may have a conception in our head of how we see the field organized and things relating, the goal of a literature review is to ensure that that can be understood by someone else. So it's really conveying how we picture this field. So it's more than just summarizing everything we've read. It's actually this analytic activity that is key to this analytic activity, is that we are able to have other people understand how we see the field of study. Now, often people find it challenging to really understand what was the shift in sort of the idea of using literature in an undergraduate level, and how this really changes when you're working at a graduate level literature review. At the undergraduate level, you may be doing some application based on your sources, but most of the time the use of literature tends to be really descriptive. At an undergraduate level, most of the time is spent focusing on summarizing previous work and demonstrating that you understand it. So in this way, there really isn't a field as much as sort of a selection of articles, and even the articles selected, the justification for them isn't present. Even the way in which we found the articles or included them in this way isn't really interrogated. It's more about sort of comprehension. At the graduate level, this is what shifts, because at the undergraduate level, I understand, I can use these, I can apply them. At the graduate level, we start looking at analysis and synthesis of sources. If we are apprentices, we are expected to be able then to work and engage with the writing of other scholars. In this way, we focus at abstract level of ideas. These are the very portable ones, rather than looking for statistics. We are engaged in evaluating what is presented, not just in terms of what was the study, what were their results, but also the way they went about it, what was their framework theoretically. And in this way, at a literature review, we are expected to justify why we included and didn't include material. We're expected to be aware and engaged in all of our sources, and that our organization is based on sort of the purpose of our review. So key here is this idea of not getting bogged down in all the details and actually rising above them to look at what is more abstract. And these abstract ideas are more portable and can be tied to our own work. So another way to sort of consider this difference between undergraduate and graduate work is that in the undergraduate level, we focus mainly on sort of what happened. But at the graduate level, we want to include what happened, but what's more interesting is, why is what happened important? Why are the results important and significant? And how does that impact the way we study the topic? Another key aspect of the literature review, particularly at the graduate level, and basically for everyone, is this idea of that we use the literature review to basically offer a view of a field because it becomes functional for the project that we're going to be doing, or the future project, or the project that's followed even in the journal article. This is why most journal articles include, basically all of them, a literature review that justifies where their work fits in. So, depending at what point you are in your academic career, you may be really familiar with the literature in your field. You may know key authors or key projects. And in this way, your role now is to sort of develop, how does your work fit in? What are the bordering puzzle pieces? What is the gap, right? We don't want to just say that we're repeating things that are already known, right? But not a lot of significance there. So rather, we look to the literature to outline the borders of the knowledge gap that then we aim for our project to fulfill. Yet, no matter how much literature we've read, there's always one thing that seems to keep graduate students up at night. There's this article out there. And either this article completely refutes your project and tells basically everyone that it's not worthwhile, or there's an article out there that basically does the exact same thing as your thesis. This is what keeps us up at night. And underlying this idea of this article is that everybody else will have read it but us. So this keeps us as graduate students kind of always going back looking for literature on the topic, just so that we can sleep, so we're not worried about this sort of article hiding out there. Now, regardless of whether we start off and we're just looking for articles that may have recently come up, or you're new to the topic and then we're actually trying to get a sense of the field, we should consider how we actually engage with searching and tracking literature. We can save a lot of time if we do this appropriately. As an undergraduate student, I felt I was a really strong researcher, but I realize now looking back that I was not very effective, because I sort of sat down and basically did a search and I got all the articles. And that was the research. Then the rest of it was reading the pile of articles in front of me. Now, when I look back, I think that this isn't really very strategic, that looking for one study, gathering a big hunk of material, in fact, doesn't address how. Perhaps I didn't use the best search terms because I didn't know them. It also doesn't address perhaps my ability to narrow down what I'm looking for after reading a few articles. So perhaps there's an alternative that we can think about rather than sort of just engaging with one big massive search. And yes, if you do one big 100 articles followed by another big 100 articles, you're still You're still doing this big massive search. And what a lot of reading. Really, as an effective approach to dealing with literature is actually to look at doing multiple searches. So rather than reading a bunch of articles before you really have an idea of what you're looking for, rather try to limit and look for just a few. I often suggest that basically look for what's been published in the past year or two and look for one or two contemporary articles. Read through those. At that point, you should be able to redefine your search terms in terms of perhaps what do they use in particular fields. You should also be able perhaps to narrow down your topic. In this way to know often even in the articles you read, their literature reviews say, okay, that's not part of what I'm engaging with. That's not part of what I'm engaging with. So by defining the borders more effectively of your field, you're actually able to do another search and track through those. And if we keep doing these smaller searches, we keep being able to sort of refine what we're getting and actually get sources that work and fit well. I think one of the challenges of literature review writing, especially when you're sort of starting out, is that you have a desire to keep everything that you've read because you put all that effort in. But when we try to keep everything that we read, we don't have a really coherent group of materials. We really don't have a field. Rather, we have kind of a random assortment, little maybe snapshots of parts of the field. I'm now in the habit that the first thing I do, whether it be a student paper or an article, is go and look at its reference section. I find I can learn a lot about an article just by going and looking at who it references. Have I read them? Have I not read who they're citing? Especially when you're familiar with the field, if everyone they're citing is someone I haven't read, chances are that this work won't really address what I'm looking for. Another way to consider it is to start tracking bibliographies, finding articles that are useful and say, okay, who are they all citing? And going back and getting those works. This is a really easy way to be able to locate who were the key ideas and authors in the field that you were studying, rather than reading everything that's been written on the topic for the past 100 years. If something was written 100 years ago and it's still relevant, chances are that it's going to be in the reference sections of most articles on the subject. We often refer to the literature as addressing a field of study. And in this way, when I think about a literature review, I think of it as in terms of an impressionist painting of a field. Up close, we just see individual colors or individual works. But when we step back, the way in which the colors are organized gives us a picture of what's going on. So in this way, we can consider each piece of work being one brushstroke towards a final image. But there is an image. In this way, the literature review is a purpose-driven document, right? It's one way to view the field. It's one painting of the same view. It contributes to the field in the way in which it offers a selection, a coordination, and an organization of individual brushstrokes or scholarly works. And really, when we look at how we're going to build and write a literature review, we need to go back to those ideas: selection, coordination, and organization, as this becomes the key to building a literature review.
One of the problems I encountered while writing the literature review for my thesis was that I dismissed and discredited sources too quickly or inappropriately. It's easy to get into the mindset, my idea is best, and this scholar is clearly missing the point. If you fall victim to this, though, you fail to see the importance and significance of the scholars that come before you. They have a lot to provide, and you should think of them lifting up your work, rather than discrediting it. Sure, their ideas and experiments are probably very different from your own, but they have something to provide. If you remember to always be positive when considering the other scholars in your field, you'll benefit from a much richer understanding of their work in the long run.
Now, when doing a literature review, we do have to make some choices, because there are different kinds of literature reviews. We can think about, is this a comprehensive literature review? If you're doing a comprehensive literature review, you must have a very, very specific topic. Why? Because a comprehensive literature review suggests that you're going to go and engage with all the work available on the topic. Whew, That's a lot of work. This is why more often than not, we're doing a functional literature review. Basically, a functional literature review is goal-oriented. It basically focuses on, why am I writing this? Functional literature reviews tend to be parts of larger documents, whether they be your dissertation, thesis, proposal. They work as part of a larger document because they determine the relationship between your work and the field. So consider that most often you're writing a functional literature review and you want to determine, okay, why am I writing this? What is the goal of the literature review? What parts of the field am I trying to offer the reader a picture of? Be aware of the scope of your literature review. Scope can be really important, particularly because the scope isn't determined by what research articles you read. Rather, it's actually going to be about what you think is important for inclusion. You can build boundary lines and say, within these, this is what I'm doing my literature review on. It can be very helpful because perhaps it is not useful to look at how nuclear energy has been viewed since the 1900s. Maybe if your topic is about contemporary Alberta, maybe you want to talk about since the 1950s in Alberta. So by highlighting the boundaries of your literature review, it can become a lot easier to write. Remember, you do not want to include everything you've read. Yeah, you think it's great, you want to show how much work you've done, but rather what you're doing is you're opening up Pandora's box. Why? The reader will assume that everything you include is a signal that it's important. So every source needs a justification. However, what will be your justification for all of these pieces? And this is why when we look at everything we've read and try to toss it into a literature review, it becomes really quite challenging to organize. So it's better to set a scope and understand what's within that scope. Also, scope gives you a good reason to say why you didn't include something, why it's excluded. So in this way, you'll be able to answer two questions when you've determined a scope: what you did include and why you didn't include things. So keep in mind that actually consciously determining a scope and writing it down and telling the reader at the beginning can actually reduce some of the questions you get. Another thing to consider when you're looking at your scope is how are you going to justify your decisions? So, were there particular materials that you looked at rather than others? Basically, you want to engage with the provenance, the objectivity, and the value of each source. And this might be rooted in your discipline. Does your discipline value monographs over journal articles? Is there an emphasis on primary sources over secondary research? In some ways, by looking at the general qualities of the research or articles you're looking at, you can get a sense of whether or not you want to include them in your scope. Also, you may want to consider that the amount of space you give to each source is a reflection of how valuable you think it is. In this way, lesser sources tend to receive little space. Sometimes a source may just be included as a citation on a longer list of articles that addressed a particular method. So consider that, along with your scope, that you also want to have a justification for the inclusion or exclusion of particular material. While all this talk about scope and justification may seem really formal, don't forget that fundamentally a literature review, like a landscape painting, is a creative exercise. There's a lot of interpretation going on. So as you're interpreting and viewing the field, remember that your particular perspective of the field will be unique to you, the project, and perhaps the background you have. So in this way, don't feel like writing a literature review is sort of a boring summary of everything that you've read. Rather, it's an opportunity to creatively reflect and to share your perspective on the works that you're reading. Remember, it's a conversation that you're documenting, not just a bunch of stuffy papers. When you're looking at the construction of your literature review, there's one really clear sign that tells you that you're failing to coordinate your sources appropriately. I like to call this the bookshelf effect. Basically, you know that you're not leaning towards analysis and synthesis when each paragraph or section talks about one particular source. If, for example, your literature review looks like a bookshelf in which you have a list of sources and you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, they're not talking to each other. So in this way, we don't want to summarize the text. We want to sort of document a conversation. And when we're documenting a conversation, this requires us to understand how each source relates to each other. This is setting up part of the analysis and synthesis of information that makes literature reviews challenging, but also really exciting. All scholarly publications, whether they be peer-reviewed journals or monographs, are moments of a conversation. Scholarship doesn't happen in a bubble. In fact, one of the key aspects of scholarship is understanding what other people are doing, what they're thinking, having discussions. So in this way, we want to have our literature review as almost as if it's a little conference in which each source gets to present their ideas, but it also gets interpreted and understood in relation to those around it. So one way that I help to imagine a literature review is to think about my books talking and talking to each other. And in this way, I can actually address divisions or arguments in the field. So I think about books agreeing or disagreeing with each other. I think of books in many ways positing particular ideas that are responded to or augmented by other works. In this way, I have a conversation going on, but one that requires me then when I write to talk about these interactions. So even though, yes, your books may not be talking to you unless you haven't gotten enough sleep, we should consider the fact that, scholars do engage in dialogue with each other. And that part of a literature review is to reflect that dialogue. What have you been listening to? So if we keep up this metaphor of a conversation, we can also think of the literature review as being a really great party planner. A strongly organized literature review is like a dinner party. In fact, a great dinner party and a great host makes sure that the people who are together can talk to each other. So rather than just having everyone sit haphazardly and hope that some discussion arises, it's actually better to group people together based on the kind of conversations that they may have. For example, my dinner party here includes several groups of people, and I try to make sure that they could have a discussion with the tables next to them. In this way, the Marxists, I expect, will be able to have a conversation with the economists at the nearby table, perhaps talking about capitalism. Marxists would talk about this idea of, the upcoming revolution, may be interested in talking with people who are very deterministic. Maybe they share a common thread. The technologists may be interested on the role of the economy, on technology development, and they also may be interested in people who are very deterministic, who may have an idea that technology creates particular content. I also have played a role in trying to separate the Marxists from the technologists, because perhaps in this dinner party I don't really know what they'd talk about. So if you can, like a wedding, plan where everyone's going to sit, similarly you should be able to sort of plan where you see particular sources being in dialogue and create borderlands in which you see there being an overlap. Another thing to consider as a way of kind of imagining your literature review is to consider that perhaps you want to organize it in terms of key trends or emerging fields in an area of study. In this way, you can talk about these trends focus on either a traditional area of study or contemporary work. In this way, you have a focus on the trends, but you are able to situate them into a broader scope of research. So therefore, emerging trends allows you to discuss traditional approaches to a topic as well as contemporary or burgeoning ones. So in this way, by thinking about shifting points, in particular trends or topics, that we're able to see sort of a traditional approach and a contemporary approach. And this allows you to sort and group your sources. One way to think about organizing your literature review is to consider the way in which the organization emerges from the literature. We think about grounded theory and the idea that you constantly go back to the material and the way that you're coding it to see if your theory is valid. Similarly, we can keep going back to the literature to see if the categories or way of organizing that we've done is continually effective when we have to approach a new source. If the idea of having your organization emerge from the literature itself is a bit challenging or confusing, another way to think about it is, imagine you're writing a how-to guide for a novice. What steps, what categories, what things would have been useful for you to know before you read all the literature? So in some ways, you consider your literature review as organized for a novice, sort of the guide to this field, an idiot's guide if you imagine. At least if we're considering it as a how-to guide for a novice, we're definitely thinking about a reader. What would the reader's needs be? Is the organization, the way in which we've grouped sources together, easily understandable for our reader? And if we can do that and keep that in mind, we'll know that we'll have a strong organization. So considering these two kind of overarching frameworks for organization, the idea that the patterns are going to emerge from the literature itself, or the idea of sort of constructing a how-to or sort of basic guide to the field, there are some things that we can also consider to structure our literature review as well, in the sort of internal or the middle sections of it. One thing that you may want to consider for your organization is definition. Using definitions can be a really easy way to review and compare literature. Most of your sources will use similar words, but they may use them for different purposes. So in this way, you can build your literature review around sort of the discussions and differences in these definitions, and also center your work, offer your definition, and how your definition relating to your project would interact or have a dialogue with these other works. If definition offers a way to kind of organize and think about grouping our sources for literature review, another way to think about it is thinking about length. The reader will determine the importance of a source in part by the space that you give it in your literature review. In this way, you may want to think about how much space you want to give to each source. Is the source important? Then chances are you're going to want to engage it in a meaningful way. Or is it less important? Then perhaps you may want to talk about it briefly. Just remember that you want to make sure that you have enough space to properly talk about all the sources. If it's important enough to be included in your literature review, as my supervisor often reminds me, it means that there's something worthwhile there. And make sure that you fully engage with your sources. What can happen sometimes if you move too quickly through a number of sources is that you may actually be offering a misinterpretation or misunderstanding of them because of your focus on brevity. So keep in mind that, shorter may say less important, but you also don't want to mean that shorter becomes a sign of misunderstanding. Another way to consider sort of organizing and having your sources talk to each other and for your overall literature review is to talk about perhaps benefits and drawbacks of particular approaches. This works well when it's centered on your future project. So when we look at the benefits and the drawbacks, there's one really key thing to keep in mind, that you need to be generous with your sources. Don't just put in a straw man or an article that you plan to tear apart. Remember, if it's valuable enough to be included in your work, it means that there has to be some value to it. So remember, if a particular work is so problematic, your reader may ask, why did you decide to include it in the first place? When considering benefits and drawbacks, the idea here is that we are sort of demonstrating the evaluative process through synthesizing and analyzing particular pieces of literature and the field as a whole. Another way to organize the material in your literature review is to think about where there are gaps in the fields and where particular works have concentrated. Because the literature review is a purpose-driven document, it means that in many ways you can highlight the gaps in the current field of literature. You can explain where perhaps you plan to pop in. At the same time, it is also useful to cue your reader on where has work in this particular topic or field tended to concentrate. Are there particular areas that tend to dominate the field? In this way, you can also suggest where is the focus of the field and what would be the value of looking to fill in that gap. Remember, when looking at gaps and concentrations, you can also suggest the limits of your project. You can explain perhaps why you're only looking at a particular subsection of theory based on the concentration model or at a particular methodology. You're not expected to fill in all the huge gaps in the literature. So perhaps you've made a choice to stick with a concentration in a particular area, and now you can insert that reasoning.
I have a very simple strategy for revising for organization in my writing. What I do is put the writing away for a few days, for as long as possible, really, given my deadlines. And then I come back to it. Because when I come back to it, I no longer have all the ideas floating simultaneously in my head in some complicated tangle. I can actually experience it more or less the way a reader fresh to the material would experience it. And at that point, I'm much more capable of evaluating the linear logic of the piece, the choices I've made about how to set out various bits of information and in what order.
Unfortunately, it's hard to give really a whole bunch of specific things to do or to avoid for a literature review. So in many ways, when we've talked about the organization of the literature or the idea of having a conversation in the field, it may feel that this is a bit of a sort of meta perspective on literature review writing. Well, each field is different. Each person's going to conceive that field differently. However, I do want to end on a little bit of a more concrete and pragmatic note. So here are my do's and don'ts for literature review writing. So the first thing is a do. Do be consistent and goal-oriented. What do I mean by this? Remember why you're writing the literature review. What project is it setting up? Is it supposed to contain everything that was ever written on the topic, or just a particular subsection, time period, or things that are useful for you? In remembering why you're writing the literature review, you're able to sort of reassert perhaps the parameters or limits that you chose for the literature review. And if you remember that it's goal-oriented, you can also remind your reader along the way. It's useful for the reader to see, aha, this is why you've included this section of literature. This is how it relates to your project. If you can keep that in mind and help the reader to remember it, you'll have a much more cohesive document. On the opposite side, you don't want to be unclear. If you can't figure out why you included a piece of literature, how this piece of literature fits the other ones in the area around it, or even your topic overall, what chance will the reader have? So remember, if you can't determine by your goal why this is here, it's going to be a lot harder for the reader. So remember, don't be unclear. If you're not sure about including it, perhaps you shouldn't include it at all. Do think about the organization of your literature review. Remember that this organization is the central idea of a literature review. It's what you're contributing to scholarly knowledge. So think about organizing it by a theme or particular criteria. Remember, you're the landscape painter. So your organization is going to determine which articles sit close together and help shape the field as a whole. Don't organize your timeline by chronology, whether it be the chronology in which they were published or the chronology of how you read the articles. This is not a strong organization strategy. And because the reader will not be familiar with your chronology of reading the articles, or if they don't know the field overall, learning about what was published in 1921 and then 1935 isn't really going to give them a sense of what your goal or purpose is. It is, however, useful to consider comparing and contrasting particular articles or approaches. In this way, you are demonstrating that you have decided to evaluate, synthesize, and analyze your material. If you're hitting on these 3 key words, then you know you're on the right track. The opposite of comparing and contrasting, being purpose-driven, and explicitly telling the reader the connection between your project and the literature review has to be juxtaposition. Don't believe that just putting 2 articles beside each other will impress on the reader why you've done that, the meaning between them. So don't be implicit in your connections. Don't assume that talking about the same articles in the same paragraph is the equivalent of giving meaning and doing synthesis. Yes, do have a critical engagement with your sources. Just remember that just because you have a critical engagement with the sources and articles that you're reading does not mean that you have to be negative. Don't overdo it. Remember, we're still apprentices in our field, which means that we shouldn't unduly criticize previous works without remembering their value. If in doubt, if it's so terrible, why did you include it in your literature review? Lastly, do give the reader directions. What do I mean by directions? I mean, tell us the purpose of the literature review at the beginning. Tell us why you've written this literature review, what you hope to accomplish with it. In doing this, you'll ensure that we're going to be able to follow you along throughout the document every step of the way. If you give us good directions, your reader won't get lost. We'll be able to figure out every step of the way what you're doing. Remember that it's not a mystery novel. We're not supposed to be investigating or seeking or searching for the meaning in your literature review. This is the problem. If we don't know where you're going and we get lost, you never know where we'll end up. You'll never know what kind of criticisms or problems we may uncover. So remember, don't write a mystery. There should be no surprises at the ends, in the middle, or at the beginning.